Well, I'll just go ahead and start with the introductions now. So first off, I'd like everybody to just go down, name, company, role, got that on the slide here. Tell us why you think you belong on this panel talking about people-based marketing and email as the kind of the linchpin here. So.
Sure, I'm Carrie Knipfer with Avery Products. You probably know us for labels and dividers, maybe not by name. I guess I belong in this panel because we're still figuring this out. Up until a couple weeks ago, our ESP was our main database, and we're trying to figure out how to get away from that structure. So I'm hoping that some people can relate to being in the infancy phase of figuring this out.
Sam?
Hi, Sam Shannon. I'm CRM with HP, HP Americas. I'm here because, well, I guess I've been doing this for a little while. I've been doing it in Americas, in Asia, and now here. And I think our greatest step is moving to a whole view of a customer rather than, I guess, a siloed view, so an omni-channel view. So that's it.
I'm Bart Thornburg. I'm Director of Email Marketing at Total Wine & More. For those, we're a national retailer, but we're not in all states, so I'll just give the 10-second description. We're a superstore for wine, beer, and spirits. We've got over 8,000 SKUs of wine, 3,500 spirits, and 2,500 different beers on our shelves. So just picture like a grocery store, except for instead of a bread aisle, you have a vodka aisle, right?
That sounds wonderful.
Lots of different options within our store, so just a really fun place to go in and shop. So I'm here thinking about email marketing. I should also mention that Total Wine is new for me, and retail is new for me, actually. I've been at Total Wine for about 85 days, and I was previously at Wedding Wire for 5 years, which was basically an online marketplace for wedding planning. So for me, I'm thinking about a lot of this in different ways, but largely in thinking about email as this single point of truth, and I've got all of these data streams coming in that I can be thinking about for personalization in my emails, and then I'm also thinking about how do we do this in a way where everything is relatable across the other channels to make sure we're doing the consistent personalization in more of an omni-channel way with social and paid and things like that. So.
Okay. And just for a little bit more context, can you also talk just real briefly about sort of the buy cycle, right? Because we have, one of the things that I think is interesting from the different perspectives here is we have 3 very different buying cycles and audiences that also help shape kind of the perspective that each panelist is offering. So Bart, why don't we start with you and come on back?
Sure, yeah, so I think that's also a really fascinating thing about the panel that we have here as well. A lot of diversity in the buyer cycle. So I'm B2C. We've got a range of customers, all sorts of people in different life stages. And people come into, depending on how close you live to one of our stores, you could be in weekly, several times a week, or you could even be in maybe once a month or once a quarter, depending on how difficult it is for you to get into one of our stores, that convenience factor. But for us, we do have a general sense that a lot of our consumers are buying wine, beer, and spirits on a weekly basis. And so figuring out where do we fit into that picture and knowing our place and their alcohol consumption and their entertaining budget. So largely we are on a really short buying cycle of weekly, basically, but really thinking about how different that is from one customer to the next.
Okay. Sam?
Yeah, we go exactly the opposite way. Our buying cycle is so long, it's very hard to keep the relationship running. So your average laptop's lasting around 3 years, and our real challenge is figuring out when a customer's ready to be back in market. And so using other signals to join to the email to try and figure out when someone's back in market is our, one of our biggest challenges, also our biggest opportunities, right?
Right. And then also you have the B2B side to worry about as well, right? So a little bit on the buying cycle there, what that looks like.
Well, B2B is a lot easier because we can have a constant story. Most businesses are always at some point in the buying cycle if it's pre-decision or ready to purchase. For me, I find the consumer is the single biggest challenge.
Great. Gary?
Sure. So we are labels, so we're a consumable. So we target a few different markets. We have the office admin who is still mailing the letters and needs a mailing label. We have the people who come in once a year to make some Christmas cards. And then we also have our small businesses who order, in bulk. So we try to target them, before their need, and then also as they're going along the journey, especially the small businesses as they're getting bigger, making sure they know about what we offer.
And so as we talk about people-based marketing, so there's this question about data, then there's the automation of that data, how do you access it, centralize it, link it all together. Just to set the context before we get into talking about sort of creating a single point of truth, would you guys mind, a couple of you mind sharing just an example of a campaign or something that you're using that's bringing that data together? So a good automation story.
Sure. We have our welcome series. So as you come in, we have a lot of third-party data that is appended to your record. So we can identify kind of who you are, and then our welcome series targets you based on that. So we know if you're an office admin at a Fortune 500, we can target your welcome email, based on that data.
Right. Sam, you have a good example?
Yeah, again, probably looking for our in-market. So we're looking across data sources about time since last purchase and activity on site and activity in email, and using that to try and figure out when people are ready to buy again.
Right. So kind of identifying in that 3-year cycle, is now the time, or is it really, are they 2.5, are they 3.5, all of that, and using...
Exactly, because we can't be trying to sell to the same people for 150 weeks in a row when they're not interested, to try and hope they're still hanging around for us to when they are interested.
Right. So let's get into some of the meat here in terms of, the title is around the single point of truth, and email is a single point of truth. So could we go down, do you have a unified customer database where there is a single point of truth? Kind of a yes or no. And if not, hint, where are you on that journey? Why don't you start, Sam?
That's yes, no, maybe. We have several and some virtual links that almost give us what we think is a single point of truth. But to be honest, I think like many people, there's some fairly fragile stitching.
Okay. Carrie, what about you?
Kind of. We have what we call our consumer database, but nobody can access it. So we have all of this data that nobody can access. So we're working on that, working toward that.
There's enough chuckles that how many people identify with that statement? I know a few people personally who struggle with that. All right, Bart.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I mean, that's an important point that I think most of us probably see where we want our internal data repository, or however we're hosting this customer data, in a better place. But access is, right, that's one of the primary things, that if the data is there and no one can act on it, then there's really no point in having that data to begin with. So I would answer the question similarly. Yes, no, maybe. I think this idea of a single point of truth and what that should look like from a marketing technology stack is a little bit different. Everyone kind of has a little bit different vision of what they like or what they think that should look like. But yeah, that's something that I think Total Wine has done really well, made good progress on, and that the data really has to be there and available for people to use.
Right, so one of the things is you start to try and build up this database. We've got this yes, no, maybe I can access it, I can't access it. There's this question of where do you find either yourself or your organization getting distracted, right? So when do we get into the idea of trying to collect too much information, or is there such a thing, right? Is it really better that hey, we can monitor every single data point, we can throw it on this huge data warehouse, we're gonna throw AI at it, it's gonna spit out magical algorithms that tell us who to target. Is that a reality, or where do you find your organizations getting distracted in this?
Yeah, so I'll start on that one because I have lots of strong feelings on this. So I think that this idea of this 360 view of a customer is a good idea. I think it's more of a North Star or a state of nirvana than something that anyone is reasonably going to achieve probably. So I think it is a great focus and something to be working toward. But for me, I think the way to not get distracted by all of these mountains and mountains of data that you have on your customers is to focus on maybe a couple. I can tell you I think of this as an email marketer, focused on email rather than cross-channel, but thinking about what are the data streams that are important for me, and it's going to be a little bit different for every marketer. But I can probably get it down to 3. Is it important that I know that my customer is the exact same person on Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, LinkedIn, MySpace, right? Like name your online venue. That probably not. It's not that important that I know them in each of those places, but 1 or 2 are going to be really important to me, and that I can kind of join that to an email address and be able to think about that as something they did in Facebook is something that I can trigger off of in email. And then I would say also just thinking about what are those behaviors that you really want to be monitoring, because I think you can get this intimidating mountain of data down to something that's really actionable, just thinking about 2 data streams that I'm going to work with today. And that's a foundation you can build on.
Right. So is it just, as you look at Total Wine, what are those 2 or 3 touch points that you guys are paying attention to right now?
Yeah, so current customer behavior is paramount, right? Especially when you think about such a short buying cycle that we were talking about, identifying, is this person a weekly shopper, are they a monthly shopper? Are they buying reds, or are they buying whites? To dig even deeper than that, is it, thinking about it from a different question, maybe they're buying cross-category and they're more into collectibles, so they're buying left bank Bordeaux's and collectible bourbons or scotch, right? So it might even be thinking about what's driving that decision-making in their purchases. But so limiting those data streams, I'm looking at what are they doing on our website, right? What are they buying in our stores? What are their price points? How frequently are they coming in? Those are the ways that I can pretty simply trigger some smart emails that are really customer-centric and talking about the things our customers want to hear about.
Right, right. Sam, what about you? So where do you find yourself getting distracted, or your organization?
Integration and speed. So lots and lots of data, lots of disparate data sources, lots of challenges integrating them, lots, challenges around primary keys and that kind of thing. So that's really quite difficult to utilize all the data, and then often when we have brought them all together, we've ended up with some big monolithic lump that's actually hard to sort of sort and sift for the actual, for the transactions that are, I guess, the trigger points that we're looking for. So.
Right, right. And you also had talked about the idea of when you're creating that data model, right, in this unified data model, you were pretty strongly opinionated about measurement in trying to figure out, okay, how do we measure if we've created the right data model, if we're creating the right programs off that? Would you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I think there's 2 big challenges, right? It's where you put it and how you use it. And so if we're building models and we're running campaigns, it's really important to be able to get the measures back immediately, particularly when you have a lot of models running. It's often very difficult to tell which campaigns or which models are actually driving the upside. Sometimes it's the simple ones, sometimes it's not. The other thing I find that's really challenging is that generally the tools that we use to put the data together are very different to the tools that we're driving transactions and getting results back through, and so it can be hard to measure them back. So that for me is a big concern. I think the other big concern is about where it all lands. So we have our data in a whole bunch of different places with, as I said, some semi-brittle links. But then if you want to transfer it all into, some great big cloud that's owned by someone else, then that's possibly even a worse scenario of having a brittle infrastructure that you own versus having someone else own, what is probably your greatest company asset.
Right. And we'll definitely touch on that topic. So, Carrie, you're in a little bit of a different situation as the sole email person in the organization, right? So, where do you find you end up focusing your energy on building this view of the customer?
Yeah, I found that before I got there, the mentality was let's store everything. Let's store all of the data in this huge data warehouse and then not be able to access it. So now I'm finding that we're starting to get smarter and figuring out the things that matter. We recently moved to an e-commerce site. We're in the 2018 coming up, and we're still just starting e-commerce. So I think ours is more behavioral, website-based data that we can easily act upon.
Got it. We also, I think, talked about this idea of a hard profile versus, you've mentioned models several times, Sam. I know that there are a couple models that get applied here. So we also talked about, do I store everything along with this individual's user profile, right? Or am I working on models? Talk a little bit about how you think about what needs to be directly tied to an individual customer versus where we're using models to get more kind of directional insight.
I think this comes from one thing. It's really great to listen to the customer, but the customer doesn't always tell the truth, right? They actually don't always identify themselves as the kind of buyer they truly are, right? So I think it becomes really important to create some softer segments or segments that have the ability to change. People's lifetime, they will ebb and flow on where they sit within those roadmaps. And so I think it's really important to go to a sort of more of a soft model or a soft segment and have segment rules and segment triggers. If the customer wants to override that, that's great. Well, you should listen. But the reality is most customers are not very good at telling you what their needs are going to be next year. Maybe next week, but not next year.
Right. Bart, anything to add there?
I'm not sure the question at this point, but do you want to restate the question?
So the idea is, do I leverage models, or do I, that maybe get into grouping and segments and that sort of thing, or is it literally attributes of a single subscriber that are really driving your program?
Yeah, I think you probably, from a strategic standpoint, want it to be some of both, right? But I would also, in my experience and looking back at all of the emails that I've sent in the last 10 years of my career, say that when I group someone into a segment and I treat you as if you're an average person in this group of people, I'm maybe going to get a 20 to 30% lift in my conversion rates from you. When I pay closer attention, and I know that this is different thinking about longer buying cycles, but when I look specifically at how you interact with my brand and how frequently and at what price point, and start talking to you in that way and stop treating you as an average person in this cohort, then I'm going to see a 300% lift in my conversion rates from you, right? And so it really is typically what I've seen, a 10x improvement in what you get, and that means you're providing a better experience for the customer too. It's not just like a business focus, great, we have awesome conversion rates, but that's a good proxy that your customer is having a good time with you, right?
Right. So if you're just to sum up how you think about kind of creating this unified individual profile, right? Single view of the customer, that sort of thing. What do you think, what would you give as advice to say this is kind of the goal, right? What's a realistic goal of what you want to be able to collect? I think that there's a universal sense of don't necessarily need every single piece of data that's out there, right? How would you advise to kind of set an appropriate goal or benchmark?
Yeah, so I would say your starting point is really to just take a good look in the mirror and figure out where you are today and what's going to be approachable. Thinking about everyone in this room, I'm sure that we're all in very different stages of this conversation. And so I think it just starts with that internal assessment of where are we today? Is the data available? Is it, how much of it are you actually recording? What are the different sources that you have coming in? Is it joinable, right? As an email marketer, if you have a bunch of data that you've been collecting on customers, but I can't join it to an email address, then that doesn't really do me much good either. I can maybe do some modeling with it, stuff like that. So for me, I would just say start with those bare minimum requirements of I need it to be joinable so that it's actionable. I need it to be available so that it's actionable. And then just, again, going back to those, pick a few data streams that, or data sources, if you want to think of it that way. Just a couple of data feeds that are worth going after. If you're retail, it's probably inline purchases, right? If you're at the point of sale machine, or if you're on the website, or you're in the mobile app. Go a little bit beyond that abandoned cart email and that's one great source of data, but also look at browse data. What products did they look at and when did they look at them? And trigger emails off of that. That's going to cast a much wider net, but still talking to your customers about relevant things that they care about.
Right. Right. Let's dig into the idea of tools and technologies, right? So what tools are each of you using in your organizations to build a customer database? Where does the email platform or marketing automation platform or whatever it is that you're using fit into that? Can you just talk about kind of the stack that you're using to bring some of this data together? And Carrie, you go for it.
Oh, sure. We're using a mix of a homegrown consumer database. Our ESP, we just recently made the switch to Iterable, so we're getting that we're getting that social data as well as our e-commerce data and being able to join all of that together. And then, of course, our analytical data from Google Analytics and other third-party data. So just putting it all together to get that single view of the customer.
Okay. Sam?
Yeah, well, we use a bunch of homegrown databases, funnily enough, for a big old company. And then we basically integrate most of that together in Marketing Cloud. We drive most of the feeds to Marketing Cloud, which is a pretty flexible environment to be working in to make those selections and driving feeds in and out for email and non-email. But the reality is that, it's probably the one place where all our data meets and talks to each other is in someone else's house.
Right. Right, we'll touch on that. Barb?
Yeah, I think hybrid model is the common theme up here. It's very hard to go out and find one company who has this all-encompassing solution that every single thing they do is best of breed and it's perfect for your use case. As a brand side customer, that's very difficult to find. And I think we each do, thinking about it from the other side and talking about ourselves as a customer, we all have pretty unique needs in what we're trying to accomplish. And so it's hard to not do that without this sort of hybrid system where some of it might live in-house and you built it, and some of it might live with a third party in the cloud. But getting back to what Sam was just saying, at the end of the day, and the theme here of it needing to be actionable, it definitely needs to be pointed toward whatever marketing cloud or ESP that you're in, so that that data is native within that environment, so you can easily trigger those emails or social messages or display ads, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I'd like to touch on this idea because of building in-house versus putting data all in a different provider. And I'd like to take this more from kind of an education and some of the thought processes that go through folks' heads as you're saying, where should the data be stored? What should be the database of record, or what should be the database of record for what? How are some of those decisions being contemplated in each of your organizations? Because all of you have a hybrid solution. So, Carrie, you want to share?
Sure. I think for us, originally, everything was stored in our ESP, and as a lot of you know, as ESPs move forward, they're now charging on a per record basis, and we have 17 million records, and from a cost standpoint, it was just too much for us to handle. So we decided that it was best for us to move to our own thing where we could control it and then manipulate it and then put it back into the ESP as needed, rather than just storing it within the ESP and going through those costs.
Right. Tim?
Unfortunately, I've never seen the data be the strategy. And every time I've seen this happen, it's always been a vehicle-driven decision. What's the best email? What's the best email platform? What's the best ad platform? And subsequently, the data is sort of slave to the platform. And I think it really should be the other way around. I mean, I think the company should keep that data asset very close and should then plug in and unplug the best platforms that they can find, which, in 20 years in this business, I've seen the best platform change 20 times. Right. But the reality is we've only probably migrated ESPs or DMPs 4 times because it's so hard, right? Because they own so much of your data. So.
Right. Bart, what about?
Yeah, I would say the root of this and the logic and how I think a lot of us are thinking about it and need to get there if we're not, is that This really should be all about empowering the marketer to do that customer-first marketing, right? The customer-centric marketing. So if your email team is, which might actually be the opposite of what you're saying, Sam, which is good, that if your email team is coming to you and saying, look, I'm agnostic, I don't care where this data lives, I don't care what our marketing tech stack is, but this is my ESP, I love it, it makes me look like a rock star, it lets me do what I need to do, provide personalization at scale, just to get me the data that I need native in my platform. Which I know that can develop into this big web of a big marketing tech stack, but I'm very much from the model of kind of empowering the marketer to do the smart things that they're trying to do.
Yeah, because there is this question about, you've got first-party data, you've got third-party data, what's the line of what you tend to put in the SaaS platforms versus what it is that you're bringing together in-house. Are you, if you say DMP data, for example, are you trying to aggregate that in-house and then push it back out to your cloud provider, or just help me to think of where those lines fall?
Well, I think at the moment you really have no choice but to put it in the cloud providers, right? Particularly, I mean, they oriented action, right? Which is one of the great things about putting the data in the ESP, right? It is ready to go and it's oriented action. But I also think in the long term that's not a great strategy, because it very much ties you probably too long to ESPs when they're not the leading candidates anymore, and it limits functionality to what's already in there. What I think we should be looking at doing is building our own data stacks, right? Not necessarily in-house. I think we need to be looking at great flexible tools that allow us to do that, but allow us to separate who is the best at go-to-market in each vehicle, right, from who is the best at understanding your customer. And I think the marketers are the best at understanding the customer, and we need to be able to, change the pointy bits as we need.
Right. And so for a large organization like HP, that may make sense. I see Bart and Carrie starting to sweat bullets up here, right? So what is your approach and how?
And that's exactly what I'm thinking. So I've worked at various size companies with various levels of funding and annual revenue, right? And some organizations are set up really nicely to have this internal team who can build an internal data repo and have it accessible. And some companies just are not currently at that stage, and they need that third-party partner to go to and to get something up and running in a matter of weeks, when it would, a lot of companies, A, they don't have the funding, but B, they don't have the team, and it would take them 12 months to hire the developers to build it, let alone start building it, right?
Right, so very much a case-by-case kind of a situation. Let's switch directions here a little bit, because we've been talking a lot about data and stacks and integrating and all of that. We've left off the where is email in the mix of this, right? So let's talk about the role of the email address. Is it truly the unique identifier? Is it the linchpin, or are you looking to other data points to be that linchpin? Start with you, Kara.
So we're a little different. We do not use email as a unique identifier. We give you a customer ID. But from the other side, if you want to use our software, you have to give us an email address so you can come back and use your, get your saved projects. So, but we have people switch emails all the time, so we try to keep the identifier with them when they come back.
Right.
It's a yes and no. In some segments, absolutely not. In other segments, absolutely yes. And I think that's one of the indicators of where you sit in that, in that spectrum between, a single home user and an enterprise.
So help unpack that a little bit. When you say some segments yes, some segments no. So who's yes and who's no?
So in the consumer space, absolutely yes. Right, we always need to be talking to a person. There is some sense that people, and there is, we have numbers on how many people change their email address, but in reality, it's still easier to talk to a person via email. When you go into the business space, you need to group emails into sites and locations and figure out who to talk to about certain subjects. If you've got a billing contact, you've got a sales contact, you've got multiple contacts.
Right, yeah, people moving jobs and all that stuff.
Exactly.
So you're constantly looking for who's the right
so
person.
the customer then becomes a location more than an actual person.
Got it, yep. Bart, what about you?
Yeah, I'll add to that I am completely agnostic on that point. It's important to have a primary key and to know that one person is one person, and anytime you kind of realize that you're counting the same person twice, to merge those and start thinking about that as an actual person now. But I don't, as long as it's joinable and it's actionable for me, I do not care if we're using email address or a customer ID or anything else. What also comes to mind for me, I'm thinking about the segments concept that Sam's talking about, is also that I don't really know the numbers on this, but I feel like I've read lots of numbers over the years that a good portion of your customers already know quite a bit about you by the time they give you your email address. They've already interacted with you in many ways on the web, through search. If you're retail, maybe they've been into your store quite a bit and they just have never raised their hand. And so thinking about all of the things that they could have been doing, interacting with my company before they gave you my email address, in that sense, obviously email address is not the primary key for them. I need to come up with some sort of other customer ID.
Right. Yeah, I think there was we as we were preparing, we had this interesting conversation about should email be the primary key, right? Is it truly the most persistent of identifiers? Because if you use email as a key, then that customer lives and dies by the use of their email address, right? So, hey, how does a mobile number factor into this? But mobile numbers change too, and they aren't, persistent. How does a Twitter handle or a Facebook profile, and to really think sort of this next gen of, hey, how do you look at a couple of these different touch points to maybe tie who is a specific individual, I think was very fascinating. And then email is really just that distribution point, right? I'm gonna use that to communicate out and proactively.
And an incredibly important one at that too. And it's not just good for finding people in their inbox, but also for finding people on Facebook, for instance, especially on the B2C side. So it is definitely a big, important piece of the puzzle, but does it need to be the primary key for me? Yeah.
Right. So I wanted to take a chance, I don't know, Steve, open it up for a few questions here.
Yeah, if you have a wrap question, then we'll go to Q&A. Do you have a wrap question, or do you want to go to Q&A?
No, I was saying that we can go to Q&A.
Questions at the panel? Yep.
Russ Young with Pronto Software. Our friend from Cabela was really, I appreciated the candor, and like, even though we have all these awesome tools for great personalization, she was forced to batch and blast. Have you guys ever run up against that as well? I think everybody in the room maybe has had some version of that. And how did you attempt to convince your boss that a better strategy might be there without insulting them?
I go through this on a regular basis. It is a battle that I fight all the time. I just show the numbers. We get the same amount of sales and conversions when we send a small send to a very segmented audience as to when we send a huge send to a bigger audience. So I just constantly have that statistic ready for when they say that. Just here you go.
Yes, everyone gets forced to do that. The hardest thing is that the immediate result is always positive. You have to look at the sort of the RPV and the longer term result, and that's the only way, is to look at to look at burning one of your critical investments, right? Which is what you're doing.
Yeah, and burning one of your most critical investments, and that, as much as anything, is the relationship with your customer, right? And how long that takes to build that up over a long period of time, and hopefully that's a customer you're keeping for a long period of time. And to burn that up just to get through that extra revenue through the holiday season or something like that is hard. But to Sam's point too, it works. Email's really good at getting people to do things, right? It's a very addressable market, a very addressable medium. And people react, they see the email, they open the email, and they react to the email, typically in pretty positive ways. It's just thinking about, and maybe that almost comes from organizationally, how are we scoring our teams? I've kind of joked that if you benchmark me on sales this week, yeah, we're going to blast everyone 5 times this week. But if you're benchmarking me on annual sales, no, it's going to be life cycle marketing, marketing automation, drip campaigns. You're going to get the emails that are relevant to you when you get them. And the shorter sighted we get on our sales and revenue goals, the that really is going to change your behavior in the emails that you're sending. But at the end of the day, this is all about, you know, providing good customer experience and a good relationship. So that's the longer view. Yep.
How are you benchmarking dissatisfaction and alienation? I mean, it seems to me that that's one of the challenges. I mean, obviously email has an unsubscribe, but that's just one metric. And one of the challenges digital has always had is proving the negatives of how much and where, this goes from publishers to advertisers, how and where are we really turning people off to us or making people blind to our brand? Are there any metrics that help you prove to those who want you to blast, that in fact there's a real negative impact here?
I still think it's better to focus on the upside, and the decreasing upside is a clear downside. I think you can spend a lot of time trying to look for that, but if you're looking at engagement, you're looking at, you know, revenue per visit, and you're looking at average life on database, those are positives that very clearly show the negative aspect.
Yeah, I like to think of something. I mean, there's a number of things that you can look at beyond unsubscribe, right? There's also your spam complaint rate. There's how many unique customers you have opening over a given period of time. So that frequency, how much of my list is actually addressable and is going to open my emails when I send them. If you watch how that goes up and down over time and correlate that with send frequency, things like that can help be a good indicator. But just on a campaign by campaign basis, one thing just to put engagement in a different view is I like to think of, instead of think of an open rate or a click rate, I think of a did not open rate, or what was your did not click rate on that email. And I think a lot of us are guilty of sending emails with did not click rate of like 95%, 97%, 98% did not click rate. So clear indicator that we're falling short on providing the customer experience they deserve.
Yeah, and I know one of the other things that we talked about that it definitely aligns with my understanding of, you know, this sort of single customer view is the need to move beyond campaign-based metrics, right? Because I think the sort of, Steve, what your question's pointing at, this, hey, do we look at unsubscribe rates? Do we look at did not click rates? The challenge is if you look at that in a campaign basis, it always tells a story, which is send something more, right? And so a lot of the work around shifting the data model to be more person-centric is to say, look, the unit of analysis should be things like LTV, overall engagement, right? A frequency of engagement, not a open rate. Open rate is really kind of a diagnostic and frankly, somewhat of a dinosaur of a metric as we start moving forward.
And that also needs to be aligned to the actual life cycle, right? Because if we're looking at LTV, you need to look at it in a scope larger than your customer life cycle, right? And I think one of the challenges that we see is this focus on daily, weekly, monthly metrics, or in fact, some of the ASPs delete all your actionable or your interaction data after 6 months. And when you're on a 3-year life cycle, then that's not very helpful, right? Because if we're going low frequency, you know, we're not going to see a lot of interaction. And, you know, what we really want to see is that, you know, 100% of our customers are interacting with us, you know, 2 or 3 times in a life cycle. They don't need to be there every week, every month, every day.
Right. So
you all have, I'm curious about, I have 2 questions. By the way, the best way to shut me up is to ask your own questions, because I'm a journalist. I will not stop.
Thanks, Steve. There you go. So Ryan Deutsch with Versado. Question to Bart. You use the concept joinable, joining a bunch of data. I'm curious, we have a lot of people in the room who are brick and clicks retailers, like you guys, I would assume. Gap, Cabela's, Best Buy, Bath & Body. Have you guys been able to join the in-store activity with the digital investment that you're making, whether it's an email as the lead or other digital channels? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about how you've been able to bridge that? And are you then able to invest against your in-store impact? Meaning, do you know what impact your channel is having in the store? Does the business buy into it and believe you? Or are we still in last click attribution and you can only grow your team as it relates to online revenue and sales?
Sure. I'm going to steal Sam's answer from earlier. Yes, no, and maybe, I think is the right answer to that. Yeah, if you're, what was the phrase, brick to click, click to brick? If you're online and you're brick and mortar, yeah, I think it's of paramount importance that you understand that that's the same customer that was just on your website who either bought something or looked at something or didn't buy something, and then is also in store maybe buying something or not buying something, right? If we don't have an understanding of who that customer is across the different touch points you have with them, then yeah, you're gonna have a really hard time sending personalized, relevant content to that person and understanding who they are. I would say it's not the end of the world. That can be a difficult thing to get to, and that's also not necessarily the end of the world. If I can do that abandoned browse email off of a website visit the next day, right, that's a pretty good email to send. That's gonna be relevant to you because I'm talking about that same bottle of Camus that you were looking at yesterday. And if the next day I don't really know that that was the same person who was in store looking at this item, but also sent them a personalized email about that, then that's still a pretty good experience too. But yeah, at the end of the day, I do think it's paramount that you understand that that's the customer, same person in both places, and that that data is joinable. And what I mean by that is just that there's lots of methods. It could be maybe a loyalty number that they enter in at point of sale when they're in line checking out, and to say, okay, well, here's their loyalty number. I can join that to an email address, and now I know in my system that this is the purchase that they made yesterday. So there's a lot of ways that you could be thinking about how to make that data joinable across different environments like that. But yeah, I think that's pretty important.
I think, I'd love to hear one of the two brands that doesn't have its own retail presence to address that question about how you're connecting to retail data.
Currently, we do not get any retail data at all, so it'd be wonderful to get it, but we don't. We don't have it.
Yeah, we've got a big silo in the way, so we don't talk to retail.
You're gonna have to raise your hand high because I can't see.
Whose question? I got one back here, Steve.
Okay.
Hi, Sean Desmond from Intercontinental Hotels Group. I was just wondering how you integrate channel preference. We have email as a single point of truth, but a lot of you referenced other channels, social media, maybe mobile app. How do you integrate that into your communications, and how important do you think that is?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. That's not going to help. I'm just trying to cover my tracks. All right, anyway, sorry. Sorry to interrupt. Please.
For us, we're not there with channel preference. It's email first, and then if we can't find you there, we then start looking elsewhere. For me, from being an email marketer, it's email first. So that's my current position. I can't say that I'm an omni-channel marketer, full stop.
Yep. Yeah, I can speak a little bit to being only about 85 days removed from my time at Wedding Wire. So at Total Wine, I'm just the director of email marketing. And at Wedding Wire, I was kind of the person thinking about omni-channel. And so for us, I had a lot of the permission-based channels, right? Email, push notifications for the mobile app, SMS, text messaging. And thinking about that, it really was, we just wanted to get to the state where we could at least even test to get a good idea of, okay, which message does best in each of these channels. And we definitely had a sort of a matrix of best practices of, okay, if we're talking about this and this is the sort of action we want, then it's push notification, right? If they need to know about it immediately, it's push or SMS, right? I'm gonna have a 97% open rate in the first 2 minutes of this being live. If it's not necessary, then maybe email. If it's longer format, then maybe email, right? So part of it is just a question of what's the message and what's the goal of the message and what's the right channel for that. And oftentimes there was only one right answer. Oftentimes there are two right answers though. And from that, I think it's just a matter of get some cohorts, some sample sizes in place that you can actually run tests against and see which is gonna convert best. That again, though, is going to treat everyone like they're an average person in that group. You really want to, I think, the nirvana state is getting to treat them as a personal touch, right? So I'm Bart, and I like this kind of message over SMS. This is Sam. He likes that same message as email, and he hates push notifications or text messages, right? So getting to that one-to-one, I think, is the nirvana.
And I'll add on just from experience from working with brands who are doing a lot of cross-channel messaging is oftentimes you'll find, there's a higher tolerance for email, right, from a frequency standpoint, and yet you will find that some people do have a preference for, it gets, you know, on transactional messaging in the hospitality space, it's pretty easy to justify sending an SMS or sending a push or something like that. But when you get into the promotional stuff, what we found is that as you increase the frequency of like an SMS push, you know, Facebook, you can get away with a higher frequency. You'll see people opting out at just a much higher rate, like very, very quickly. So it's sort of trying to draw that balance of what's the right message for the channel. Every once in a while, I can sneak in a promotional kind of deal on maybe a more intimate channel.
We are we'll continue this at the round table at the end of the morning. Morgan, panel, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.